They don't fall for love. They retreat from it. Yet there is one kind of presence that makes even the most distant soul stop and kneel, not through force, not through pursuit, but through something far more dangerous. Quiet understanding that they cannot escape. If this is resonating with you, pause for a moment and ask yourself, are you trying to chase connection? Or are you becoming the kind of presence that invites it? Stay with me because what comes next changes everything. The first idea is that deep empathy disarms emotional defenses, and this is not the soft, comforting kind of empathy people usually imagine. It is the kind that feels like emotional precision, where the empath does not rush in to soothe, fix, or interpret the avoidance behavior as rejection. Instead, they quietly perceive what is underneath the behavior without trying to change it. Avoidant individuals are not simply distant for no reason. Their distance is a protective structure built from past emotional overwhelm, inconsistency, or loss of control. So when they sense someone approaching them with emotional intensity, neediness, or expectation, their system automatically activates defense mechanisms like withdrawal, detachment, or emotional numbing. But deep empathy does not trigger those defenses because it does not create pressure. This empath type listens without urgency. They observe without judgment. They respond without attempting to close the gap too quickly. That creates something unfamiliar for the avoidant, safety without demand. In most relationships, emotional engagement comes with hidden contracts like, if I open up, you must stay, or if I am vulnerable, you must respond in a certain way. Deep empathy removes those invisible contracts. The avoidant begins to sense that their inner world is not being invaded or evaluated. This lowers their psychological guard because the threat of engulfment disappears. Over time, this creates a paradoxical effect. The more the empath does not chase, the more the avoidant feels seen. And the more they feel seen without being pressured, the less they need to escape. Their nervous system starts to recalibrate because it is no longer operating under the assumption that closeness equals loss of autonomy. Instead, closeness begins to feel optional rather than forced. What makes this so powerful is that it bypasses the avoidant's usual resistance. You cannot argue them out of their defenses, and you cannot love them hard enough to collapse them. But you can create an emotional environment where those defenses are no longer necessary. Deep empathy does exactly that by offering presence without possession, attention without intrusion, and understanding without demand. And in that rare space, the avoidance walls begin to loosen naturally rather than being broken. The second idea is that avoidants fear engulfment but crave understanding, and this contradiction sits at the core of their emotional world. On the surface, they appear detached, self-sufficient, and even indifferent to deep emotional bonding, but internally there is a constant tension between wanting closeness and protecting autonomy. What they fear most is not love itself, but the loss of control that they associate with emotional intimacy. To them, closeness often feels like pressure to perform, respond, or merge identities with another person, which triggers an instinct to retreat before they feel trapped. Yet beneath that retreat is a quieter layer of need. Avoidants do not reject understanding. They reject the conditions that usually come with it. Most people try to reach them through intensity, emotional demands, or repeated reassurance seeking, which unintentionally reinforces their fear of engulfment. Every attempt to get closer can feel like an invasion, even when it is rooted in love. This is why they often pull away precisely when someone is trying hardest to connect. However, when understanding is offered without demand, something unusual happens. If an empath or partner can perceive their emotional state without trying to correct it, interpret it as a problem, or rush them into vulnerability, the avoidant begins to feel something unfamiliar. They are being seen without being consumed. This is the rare space where their defenses start to soften. Understanding in this sense is not agreement or approval. It is the absence of pressure. It is the ability to hold their contradictions without forcing resolution. The avoidant can be distant today and slightly open tomorrow, and instead of reacting to these shifts with anxiety or pursuit, the empath remains steady. This steadiness removes the emotional chase dynamic that usually fuels avoidance. As this pattern repeats, the avoidant begins to separate past emotional danger from present emotional experience. They slowly realize that closeness does not always equal loss of self. The craving for understanding starts to outweigh the fear of engulfment, because for the first time, understanding is not being used as a tool to pull them closer, but as a space where they are allowed to exist exactly as they are without being consumed by it. The third idea is that the rare empath mirrors without chasing, and this is where the dynamic shifts from emotional pursuit to psychological influence. Most people, when faced with an avoidant, enter a cycle of over-efforting. They try harder, explain more, send longer messages, or emotionally escalate in order to get a response. But this chasing energy is exactly what activates the avoidant's instinct to withdraw. It creates pressure, and pressure feels like loss of freedom. The more someone pursues, the more the avoidant pulls away to restore internal balance. The rare empath operates in the opposite way. Instead of chasing, they mirror. But this mirroring is not imitation in a superficial sense. It is emotional reflection without intrusion. They match the pace, not the panic. They respond to the energy being offered, but they do not amplify it into desperation. If the avoidant is distant, they remain calm. If the avoidant opens slightly, they respond with measured presence, not emotional overload. This creates a psychological experience the avoidant is not used to, interaction without pressure to change. Mirroring without chasing disrupts the avoidant's expectation system. Normally, they expect two outcomes in relationships. Either someone becomes emotionally intense and overwhelming, or they withdraw completely and disappear. Both outcomes confirm their internal belief that closeness is unstable. But when they encounter someone who neither escalates nor abandons, their nervous system cannot categorize the experience easily. This creates cognitive dissonance, a subtle but powerful psychological tension. In that tension, curiosity begins to form. The avoidant starts to monitor the empath more closely, not out of fear, but out of confusion. Why is this person not reacting the way others do? Why is there no pressure, no emotional collapse, no demand for immediate closeness? This question becomes internally active even when externally they remain distant. Because there is no chasing, there is no resistance to push against. Instead, the avoidant is left with space to self-reflect. And in that space, something shifts quietly. The absence of pursuit becomes more noticeable than pursuit itself. The empath becomes emotionally present but not invasive, consistent but not consuming. This balance makes the avoidant lower their guard, not because they are convinced, but because they are no longer being pulled. The fourth idea is that emotional safety dissolves avoidance patterns, and this does not happen through persuasion or emotional intensity, but through repetition of calm, non-threatening experiences. Avoidant behavior is not random. It is a learned, protective response built around the expectation that closeness eventually leads to emotional loss of control, disappointment, or pressure. So their system stays alert, scanning for signs that intimacy is becoming too demanding. The moment they detect emotional urgency, they begin to distance themselves as a form of self-regulation. Emotional safety interrupts this cycle, but safety here does not mean comfort in the usual sense. It means predictability without pressure. When an empath consistently shows up without escalating demands, without reacting dramatically to distance, and without interpreting silence as rejection, the avoidant starts to experience relationships differently. There is no emotional punishment for withdrawal and no emotional suffocation for closeness. This removes the extremes that usually define their relational experience. At first, the avoidant does not trust this stability. They may test it by pulling away, delaying responses, or creating subtle distance to see if the other person will chase or react. In most cases, people fail this test by either overreacting or disengaging. But when the empath remains steady, something important happens internally. The avoidant's nervous system begins to recalibrate its expectations. The old association between intimacy and danger starts to weaken. Over time, repeated exposure to this kind of emotional environment begins to soften their defenses. They no longer feel the same urgency to escape because nothing in the interaction is forcing them into emotional overload. This is where patterns begin to dissolve. Not because the avoidant has been convinced logically, but because their body no longer registers closeness as an immediate threat. In this state, avoidance loses its original function. It was never about rejecting connection itself, but about avoiding emotional overwhelm. When overwhelm is no longer present, the need for distance decreases naturally. The empath's consistency becomes the stabilizing force that replaces fear with familiarity, and in that familiarity, the avoidant slowly begins to stay present longer than their instincts originally allowed. The fifth idea is that silence and space can be more powerful than pursuit. And this challenges everything most people believe about emotional connection. In typical relational dynamics, silence is interpreted as rejection, distance is taken as disinterest, and absence triggers anxiety that leads to chasing behaviors. But with avoidant individuals, pursuit only strengthens their internal need to withdraw. The more someone fills the silence with words, explanations, or emotional pressure, the more the avoidant feels their inner space is being invaded. Silence, when held with emotional stability, does something entirely different. It is not passive waiting or emotional withdrawal. It is intentional non-interference. The rare empath understands that silence is not an absence of connection, but a different form of it. Instead of filling every gap with reassurance or questions, they allow emotional space to exist without immediately trying to resolve it. This creates a psychological environment where the avoidant is not being pursued, evaluated, or emotionally cornered. In that space, something subtle begins to happen. The avoidant, who is used to controlling distance as a form of safety, starts to notice that the absence of pursuit does not lead to abandonment from the other side. There is no emotional chase, no escalation, no collapse into desperation. This disrupts their expectation pattern. They are no longer in a dynamic where they must constantly defend their autonomy. Space also gives the avoidant room to reflect without pressure. When they are not being emotionally pulled, they can process their own feelings at their own pace. Ironically, it is in this absence of pursuit that emotional awareness begins to surface. Thoughts about the connection arise naturally because they are not being forced. The empath's ability to remain steady in silence communicates something deeper than words ever could. Presence without possession. It signals that connection does not require constant reinforcement to exist. And for someone who has long associated intimacy with intrusion, this realization is quietly destabilizing in a transformative way. Over time, silence stops feeling like distance and starts feeling like safety, and in that shift, the avoidant begins to move closer, not because they are chased, but because they are finally not being pursued at all. The sixth idea is that avoidants respond to emotional consistency, not intensity, and this distinction is often misunderstood in relationships. Many people assume that strong emotions, dramatic expressions of love, or frequent reassurance will break through an avoidant's walls. In reality, intensity often has the opposite effect. It creates unpredictability, and unpredictability activates the avoidant's internal alarm system. When emotions rise too quickly or fluctuate too strongly, the avoidant interprets it as a signal that they may soon lose control of the relational environment, which pushes them back into withdrawal. Emotional consistency works differently because it removes the element of threat. It is not about being emotionally flat or detached, but about maintaining a stable presence regardless of fluctuations in closeness or distance. The rare empath does not shift their emotional state dramatically based on the avoidant's behavior. If the avoidant pulls away, they do not escalate. If the avoidant comes closer, they do not overwhelm. This creates a predictable emotional rhythm that the avoidant's nervous system can gradually adapt to. At first, this consistency may go unnoticed or even be tested. The avoidant might withdraw more, delay responses, or create emotional distance to see if the empath reacts differently under pressure. In most relational patterns, this triggers inconsistency in return, either through anxiety-driven pursuit or emotional withdrawal. But when the empath remains steady, something important begins to shift internally. The avoidant starts to register that their usual strategy of distancing does not produce chaos or abandonment on the other side. This lack of reaction becomes psychologically significant. It removes the reinforcement loop that usually sustains avoidant behavior. They are no longer escaping from emotional intensity because intensity is not being offered. Instead, they are met with a calm continuity that does not demand immediate emotional engagement, but does not disappear either. This balance is unfamiliar and therefore compelling. Over time, emotional consistency creates a sense of reliability that bypasses the avoidance defenses. They begin to associate the connection with stability rather than pressure, and this slowly reduces the need to protect themselves through distance. The absence of emotional volatility allows trust to form in a way that does not feel forced or overwhelming, and in that quiet stability, the avoidant begins to remain present longer than their usual patterns would normally allow. The seventh idea is that the empath's self-respect creates a magnetic tension that the avoidant cannot easily dismiss. This is not self-respect as a performance or a boundary stated loudly for control, but a quiet internal structure that does not bend in response to emotional withdrawal or inconsistency. Avoidant individuals are highly sensitive to subtle relational dynamics, especially those involving dependency and emotional imbalance. They are accustomed to others adjusting themselves, overextending or collapsing into pursuit when distance is introduced. This creates a predictable pattern where they unconsciously hold more power in the emotional field simply by withdrawing. When the empath does not collapse into that pattern, the entire dynamic changes. Self-respect in this context means the empath does not abandon their emotional center to maintain proximity. They do not chase clarity when silence appears. They do not over-explain their value when it is not acknowledged. They remain engaged but not entangled. This stability creates an unfamiliar tension for the avoidant because it removes the usual emotional leverage they are used to, even if they do not consciously use it. Without chasing energy on the other side, the avoidant no longer feels in full control of the relational distance. At the same time, they are not being pressured or demanded upon, which means there is nothing obvious to reject. Instead, they encounter someone who remains steady without needing to be chosen in every moment. This balance disrupts their expectation that closeness requires the other person to become emotionally flexible at their expense. What emerges is a form of magnetic uncertainty. The avoidant begins to notice that their usual withdrawal does not produce emotional collapse, pleading, or overreaction. Instead, it meets grounded presence. This absence of reaction creates curiosity because it contradicts their internal model of relationships. They start to question the emotional stability of the connection, not in terms of safety alone, but in terms of depth and significance. Self-respect also signals emotional independence, which the avoidant unconsciously respects even while fearing closeness. They are drawn to what does not attempt to control them. The empath's refusal to lose themselves in pursuit creates a silent boundary that cannot be crossed through avoidance tactics. Over time, this generates a tension between distance and attraction, where the avoidant feels both free and subtly pulled towards something they cannot destabilize or fully predict, and that unresolved tension becomes the space where deeper connection begins to form. The eighth idea is that true connection emerges when control is surrendered. And this is the point where the entire psychological structure of avoidance begins to soften at its deepest layer. Avoidant individuals are not simply afraid of people, they are afraid of what happens when emotional control is lost. Control for them is safety. It regulates how close someone gets, how much is revealed, and how quickly emotional intensity can be managed. As long as control remains intact, they feel protected, even if they are emotionally distant. But authentic connection does not grow in control. It grows in moments where neither person is trying to manage the emotional outcome. The rare empath does not attempt to steer the avoidant toward closeness, nor do they force emotional clarity on demand. They remain present, but they do not dominate the direction of the bond. This creates an environment where control is no longer held tightly by either side. The empath is not controlling by chasing, and the avoidant is not controlling by withdrawing in reaction to pressure. At first, this lack of control feels unsettling to the avoidant. There is no predictable emotional script to follow, no pressure to resist, and no emotional collapse to trigger their usual defenses. Instead, they are left in a space where the connection exists without being managed. This is unfamiliar because most of their relational experiences have been shaped by cycles of pursuit and escape, where control always had to be reasserted to maintain emotional safety. In this new dynamic, something subtle begins to surface. Without the need to control every interaction, the avoidant starts to experience moments of genuine presence. Not analysis, not defense, not withdrawal, but simple presence. And in those moments, emotional walls are not broken. They simply become unnecessary for a brief time. The system that once demanded distance begins to pause because nothing is forcing it into activation. Surrendering control does not mean losing identity or autonomy. It means no longer needing to constantly regulate closeness through fear. When both individuals stop trying to manage the emotional flow, connection stops being a negotiation and becomes an experience. For the avoidant, this is the most disarming realization of all, that closeness does not require control to survive. And in that realization, the distance they once relied on begins to lose its necessity, allowing connection to form in a way that feels both safe and real without being forced or contained.